There's a lesson to be learned from the words of my good friend Terry Greer for all of you to keep in mind. If you're going to have someone introduce you, be sure to ask a friend. You know, as I've said on other occasions, what Terry has just said about me are the kinds of things that my father would like to have heard if he were alive, and my mother would actually have believed. It's a delight to be here, and I want to thank Terry very much for his kind words. And this is a special occasion for me to be here for many reasons. I'll mention a couple of them in a second, but Terry did mention the real world of politics there, and there are two people only that I want to mention, and I'm going to ask them both to stand up simultaneously, because one is a rather older hand at the game, and one is just starting, but they're two great women. One is a member of Parliament for the riding just west of here, and the other is about to be a member of Parliament for this area. Will the two women please stand up? Where are they? Linda McQuaig and where's Olivia? There's Olivia and Linda McQuaig. This is special for me for two particular reasons. One is, of course, the lecture is named after Jack, and the second is that the first person to give this lecture was Charles Taylor. Both of these individuals were and are respectively friends of mine, but much more important, each in his own way made a great contribution to Canada as living, breathing, active social democrats. So it's a pleasure for me to join that company and give this lecture tonight. I'm going to preface the lecture with the following words. As all of you in this room will almost certainly know, I spent most of my life as a politician, as Terry has just indicated, but also as an academic. And when I was a politician, I gave speeches, political speeches, that are noteworthy for being short on facts. Some facts were there. With lots of rhetoric, dubious logic, but with a little luck, quite entertaining. But the other kinds of talks I gave were lectures as an academic. And lectures tend to be full of real facts. Logic is impeccable. The conclusions actually follow from the premises. But they can be quite boring. Right? Now, the reality is I was asked to give a lecture tonight, not a speech. And I hope by the end of the lecture, you won't hope that I was invited to give a speech. But I do intend to talk seriously about social democracy. As Terry has said, this has been something that I learned philosophically, so to speak, when I was teaching philosophy, and then I carried into practice, or tried to, from being a member of Parliament in my hometown of Oshawa, and has been with me all my life. And so I do want to talk about what I think that concept, and it's a very broad concept, and it's been given various meanings, actually does mean. And I want to begin by saying that when I graduated from university at that other downtown university here in Toronto, in 1959, my classmates and I had 5 jobs available for each of us when we graduated. Student debt was low or non-existent. Throughout Canada, well-paid unionized workers were flourishing. Unemployment insurance and universal family allowances were in place. And just around the corner in the 1960s were hospital care, then universal health insurance, and then the Canada Pension Plan. Our neighbors in the United States were even more unionized then than we were. Jobs were plentiful there, and thousands of their veterans had gone without fees to well-funded, high-quality state universities. And since 1935, well before us, all Americans have been entitled to Social Security. This was the model that our Canada Pension Plan was actually built on. Both of our countries, then, took for granted seriously progressive income taxes to pay for such benefits. Americans had first talked about the American dream, believe it or not. First documented talk was in 1930. But it was no surprise that it wasn't until 1960 that a majority of Americans first described themselves as middle class. Nor was it a surprise that about at the same time, not before, here in Canada, we Canadians began to describe ourselves as sharing and caring. Certainly before that period, before the Second World War, Canadians didn't talk that way for the good reason we had governments that neither shared nor cared. All right? At the same time, this is around 1960, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, the northern countries in Western Europe were well on their way to developing the most egalitarian societies in history. 100 years earlier, that great American, Abraham Lincoln, had used words that were finally starting to ring true. By the 1960s, millions of ordinary men and women had begun to believe there was government not only by and of, but also for the people. Yes, there was still some poverty, unemployment, and inequality, especially between women and men, and between whites and racial minorities. But by 1960, it was widely seen and believed that history was moving in the right direction. The age of equality, that, to use the phrase of the time, the age of the common man, it was believed had arrived. When I graduated as a working class kid, as Terry has said, from Oshawa, the world was my oyster. I believed then, and I believe now, I was very lucky. What I have just described is what could be called the beginning of the flourishing of social democracy. Today I want to talk about what social democracy is, what it is not, what Canadians today think about its values, and whether it can survive. In so doing, I want to talk about social democracy both as a distinct historical political reality and in particular as a set of values and views about individuals, the community, and the state, which not only have a starting point in history, but continue to speak to our current conditions as Canadians. Although social democracy has its roots in late 19th century Europe as a functioning, widespread governing system with definable characteristics, it was not until the second half of the 20th century that it really came into its own. Rising from the ashes of the Great Depression and World War II, it emerged as the most serious alternative to both state socialism and pre-war liberal democracy. Social democracy can be seen as the result of the clash between democracy and capitalism, as the political outcome that favored societies based on community and mutuality over market-driven selfishness. While accepting market principles for most aspects of the economy, it rejected outright the view that capitalist market relationships should be allowed to completely dominate society. Unlike democratic parties and movements on the right, it rejected both the priorities and highly commercialized inegalitarian outcomes or governments that permit this kind of domination. What I will now say about the nature of social democracy, to put it frankly, is based on my understanding of what social democratic parties and leaders were actually doing and saying in the decades immediately after World War II. In this, I have in mind some very exceptional politicians and parties, values and practices found particularly in Canada and Western Europe. Tommy Douglas here, as well as other leaders that I subsequently came to know. Willy Brandt in Germany, Olof Palme in Sweden, Bruno Kreisky in Austria, Joop den Uyl in the Netherlands, the CCF and the NDP, along with Labour, Social Democratic, and Socialist parties in Western continental Europe. It was in this real world of politics that what social democracy is all about became clear. Programs reflected and embedded values that have reshaped the meaning of democracy itself and have persisted to this day. What then are the social democracy's core values? As the Canadian and European experience vividly demonstrates, Social Democrats have a deep commitment to the civil and political liberties historically associated with liberal democracy. In fact, in Canada, the traditional freedoms of speech, religion, association, and assembly have been more vigorously and systematically defended by the CCF and the NDP than by either the Conservative or Liberal parties. Whether it was opposition to Duplessis' padlock laws in Quebec, the wartime treatment of Japanese Canadians in BC, the federal imposition of the War Measures Act, or the initial national political struggles for the rights of First Nations, women, and gays and lesbians, as politicians, it was Social Democrats who were in the lead on these matters. In Europe, during the 1930s and 40s, in their defense of individual rights, Social Democrats had opposed totalitarian governments of both the left and the right. And for thousands of them, literally thousands, the cost was concentration camps and the loss of their lives. While traditional political and civil liberties have been important to Social Democrats, it has been the historically new struggle for social and economic rights that has been their most distinctive contribution to the quality of modern democracy. It was a Canadian Social Democrat, and I'm always amazed to rediscover this, that this is not taught in our schools. It was a Canadian Social Democrat, John Humphrey, who wrote the first draft of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was adopted by the United Nations in 1948. I'm tempted to ask how many of you, I will ask, how many of you knew that? Well, maybe 20%, something like that. It was certainly never taught when I was around 100 years ago as a student. Anyway, it was John Humphrey who wrote the first draft. And in his autobiography, he was clear about the centrality of social and economic rights to the lives of ordinary people. Such rights are important in themselves, but Humphrey stressed that without them, other human rights have little meaning for most people. Social and economic rights for all, that is to say, access to decent employment, health care, education, pensions, food, a union, among others, were not only included along with traditional civil and political rights in the Universal Declaration, but were also embodied in a separate covenant in 1976. In the same year, this covenant was ratified by Canada and became a part of international law as a core element of the United Nations International Bill of Human Rights. Prior to ratifying the covenant, the government of Canada obtained the written endorsement or agreement of all our provincial governments to its provisions. Although it was the CCF and the NDP that led the Canadian struggle for social and economic rights, it is important to note that other parties played a key role in their implementation. It was John Diefenbaker's Progressive Conservative Party that brought in a national hospitalization program and some other progressive measures. And it was Lester Pearson's Liberals who enacted universal health care legislation and introduced the Canada Pension Plan. A crucial characterization of education, health care, and pensions as non-means-tested human rights, social rights, is that they illustrate social democracy's determination to ensure that key aspects of life are not treated as commodities to be bought and sold in the market, to be accessible only to those with adequate purchasing power. In effect, this means in a market-driven economy, there is a need to decommodify certain aspects of life. The need is to take the price and therefore the income position of the recipient out of the criteria for eligibility. With no means test and no price at point of delivery, they become rights of citizenship to all individuals, obligating our governments to ensure their provision up to the level of their economic capacity to deliver. In terms of international law and the related covenants adopted by Canada, such rights have a legal status equal to that of political and civil rights. In 1993 in Vienna, the United Nations, at a conference that I had the pleasure to attend, reaffirmed the legal equality and mutually reinforcing nature of all categories of rights. By the way, at the same meeting, the UN also called on the world to protect environmental needs of present and future generations. By extending the areas of life to be available as social rights, we not only increase the degree of equality in society, we also, over time, reduce the need and demand for ever-increasing incomes. If accessible child care, free universities, adequate pensions, health care, and affordable housing become effective rights, evidence has begun to show that the effect of such equalizing can be a reduction in demand for ever more consumer goods in our lives. And I believe personally that if we Canadians ever reach the day when a no-growth economy becomes acceptable to the majority, it will be because of greater equality, in good measure achieved by the expansion of social rights throughout society. As I have said, Social Democrats accept the basic tenet of a market-based economy, the price and profit mechanism. Officially, most Social Democratic parties have made this clear, at least since Germany's Social Democrats, the world's largest Social Democratic party, rejected its Marxist framework in 1959. And by the way, Ellen and I, my partner, Ellen Wood, is here, and we checked the news reports from Germany, and I'm pleased to say that if you look at what happened in Germany just in the last 48 hours, the parties on the left, that is the Social Democrats, the Links, and the Green Party, actually got a majority of votes in Germany. They did. Along with the Scandinavian parties in particular, the New Democratic Party of Canada believes that higher levels of employment, of gender and economic equality, social rights, civil liberties, and environmental economic sustainability can be achieved with a form of capitalism in which government plays a major role, better than with any other economic system. We see an important role for unions and government regulation of the market and corporations to ensure that they operate in the public interest. Social democracy, then, is neither a capitulation to capitalism, nor is it a halfway step to socialism. The terrible consequences for so many people throughout the world that followed the economic crisis in 2008, as well as the inherent inequality and profit-driven pursuits of the market, should not lead to the wholesale rejection of the market. Rather, what is required is the wholesale rejection of predatory capitalism that even, I want to speak candidly, some social democratic parties helped create or sustain at the end of the 20th century. An unrealizable dream of a perfectly equitable, conflict-free society should not take us away from the immediate goal of reforming present-day capitalism. For Canada to retain current economic policy after years of growing inequality and the global disaster of 2008 would be foolish and unjust. In addition to maintaining the basic political provisions of liberal democracy, the commitment to a broad range of social rights and the retention of a market-based economy, Social Democrats have also sought to ensure that income inequality remains within socially acceptable limits. To achieve this, government action is required to counter the inherent inegalitarian thrust of a market-driven economy. In addition to social rights, different approaches have been taken. Some progressive governments, for example, in Europe, have emphasized shaping market outcomes via measures such as the encouragement of unions, minimum and living wage policies, high levels of technical training, and tough corporate responsibility laws. Others have relied more on government action to redistribute market income. The most equal social democratic societies in the world have been those where market incomes have been kept relatively equal by means of high employment, good jobs, and strong unions, and then further equalized through high levels of social spending financed by progressive taxes. As much as anything, Social Democrats have emphasized the need, I want to stress, emphasize the need for jobs. For most of the second half of the 20th century, a multiplicity of approaches: industrial strategies, resource management, public ownership, corporate social responsibility, co-determination, have been used as necessary interventions in the market in order to provide satisfying employment to all men and women in the labor force. On a personal note, a historian friend once looked at all my speeches and questions in the House of Commons over an extended period of time, an act of masochism and friendship combined. And what he discovered is, by a long shot, I emphasized in those speeches and interjection job creation. It was number one issue that I spent my time on, both as an MP and after that as leader of the party. So jobs are important for human beings. Finally, as part of the democratic legacy, social democracy has been open to the claims and involvement of new social movements. This was true in the 70s in its response to the women's movement, and more recently to environmentalist activists who drew our attention to the vital issue of the state of the globe. In Canada and abroad, social democratic parties have incorporated in their agendas sustainable economic policies first proposed by activists in civil society. They were ahead of the parties, but the parties that listened to them first were social democratic parties. Our commitment to building a green economy, good jobs, and pollution reduction is now one of the fundamental differences that stands out between the NDP today in the House of Commons and Harper's Conservatives. It's a big difference. Social Democrats have supported these movements for a green and equitable economy because that's what our values are about: fairness, social justice, and a conception of economic sustainability measured not just by profits, but by the social goods and a healthy environment. After 1945, most governments in Western Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand had broadly defined social democratic approaches. In continental Europe, while remaining more conservative on social policy, some Christian democratic parties had what the Germans call a social market approach to the economy, which was similar in some key respects to their social democratic rivals. Until 1960, note this, until 1960, the United States, still under the impact of Roosevelt's New Deal, as I suggested earlier, had also embarked on an agenda similar to that of social democrats elsewhere. In his last presidential address to the American people, near the end of the war, Roosevelt said that when it came to rights, the U.S. Bill of Rights, a set of political and civil rights, was inadequate. I know, I stress, Roosevelt said this was completely inadequate. In the same speech, he called for, and I quote, an economic Bill of Rights that included a list of rights subsequently found in the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. He was the first and last U.S. president to make such a declaration. His speech did, however, reflect the broad range of policies his administration had put in place during his 3 terms in office. Until 1960, in fact, government spending as a percentage of GDP in the United States, although lower, was in the same neighborhood as that of social democratic governments elsewhere in the North Atlantic world who had embarked on egalitarian agendas. However, while these other democracies saw steady increases in government spending on social policies for several more decades, in the United States such expenditure leveled off after 1960. Instead, the U.S. evolved towards increasing inequality and a minimum safety net means-tested version of a welfare state, quite different in theory and practice from one based on social rights and efforts to minimize income inequality. And we now know the social consequences of the very different kinds of welfare states. The evidence is clear. The social democratic commitment to equality has made a major difference. OEC data and that of individual scholars like Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, with whom I have met in the UK and had the pleasure of welcoming them to Canada, have shown that more equal societies have much better social outcomes. I want to emphasize, I'm sure a number of you are familiar with this, but we can't repeat it too often to the people of Canada. More equal democracies have superior results in terms of health, crime rates, levels of civic participation, teenage pregnancies, and social mobility. The most equal democracies found in Northern Europe have the best outcomes in all of these categories. The most unequal, the United States and the United Kingdom, have the worst. In a major address to the American people 2 months ago, which I watched part of it on a television network, this is just 2 months ago, President Obama emphasized the need to deal with growing inequality in the U.S., the weakness of unions, and the decline in upward social mobility in the United States. I would add he could have noted what has been true for some 2 decades: to better realize the American dream, his fellow citizens should move to Scandinavia. Right. Social democracy today, I have here a reality check in post-2008. It's become commonplace to point out that social democratic values and practices are currently under threat even in Scandinavia. Once reasonably equal European nations have recently become less so. Current austerity policies within the European Union have simply made a bad situation worse. Inequality is growing, and youth unemployment is hovering between 40% and 50% in Spain, Portugal, and Greece. As the New York Times recently pointed out, the once globally admired European social contract appears to be unwinding. Ignoring the Keynesian lessons learned from the 1930s, many European governments have imposed austerity without regard to its social impact. Meanwhile, with this growth in inequality and unemployment, nationalist, right-wing, anti-foreigner parties are on the rise in many European countries. How has this come about? And are we involved in a replay of some version of the 1930s? Is this possible? Much has been written about the unraveling of the social consensus in Europe and the reduction of the role of governments elsewhere. Global and national market forces, as well as changing technologies, have certainly played a significant role in creating the current extreme levels of inequality and instability. However, what I want to stress tonight is that the evidence is equally clear that ideology and government decisions have had a major impact in creating the new inequality, in its acceptance and in its perpetuation. It's not accidental that while all states have been experiencing rising inequality, some have coped much better while others have deliberately reinforced it. In both cases, ideology has played a major role. Quoted in The New Yorker just a few years ago, David Frum, the Canadian-born one-time speechwriter for George Bush, himself emphasized the role of ideology. He accurately described the widely shared objective of the American and British conservative intelligentsia and politicians who emerged at the end of the 1970s. They sought through political parties and right-wing think tanks, and Frum's words, quote, to roll back social democracy, end of quote. After coming to power, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan took advantage of political discontent in both countries, in part generated by high inflation and a major international oil crisis, to embark on their anti-government and anti-union mission after they were elected. This was not the approach, I want to stress, of earlier conservatives like Dwight Eisenhower or Harold Macmillan, who had governed by making policy changes that sought to maintain some kind of cross-class consensus. Macmillan's government had made major investments in public housing, and he later criticized Thatcher for her assault on British Crown corporations. Another conservative, get this one, Richard Nixon, introduced environmental protection legislation in the United States and produced the greatest increase in American social entitlements since World War II. Before he retired, Eisenhower, aware of increasing corporate power, warned of what he called the military-industrial complex. Like Robert Stanfield, Joe Clark, and here in Ontario, Bill Davis, these British and American conservatives had a respect for the positive role of the state or government. The truth is that today's so-called conservative movement, so admired by Stephen Harper, has nothing to do with the traditional conservatism at all. In reality, it is, as Milton Friedman himself once pointed out, a form of neoliberalism, a deregulated economy, reduced social spending, and the privatization of the public sector. In short, capitalism at its most brutal. For Thatcher and Reagan, traditional conservatism was all wrong. Government was the problem, not the solution, said Reagan. And ideologically, both of them, in Thatcher's words, made this clear. She said there was no such thing as society, only individuals existed. These strong, and they were politically, systematically underestimated by the left, these strong right-wing leaders brought to the forefront of public debate, and I want to emphasize this, the false antithesis promoted by right-wing think tanks of an alleged necessary conflict between individual and government on the one hand, of individualism versus statism. They even created a new international organization of conservative parties whose mandate specifically excluded social and economic rights. Rights, by the way, that are included in the Christian Democratic International, which the Christian Democrats in Germany belong to. The development of post-war social democracy had demonstrated how false this alleged necessary conflict was. As the historian Tony Judt pointed out in his magnificent book, Post-War, progressive taxation and the expansion of the government's role in creating so many social programs beneficial to the majority made it possible for the first time in history for so many children of poor and middle-income families, including Jude himself, to actually develop their talents and skills. Rather than repress individualism, the social democratic state is a necessity for it to flourish among the many. Rather than being a threat to democracy, for a majority of the population, government can be the source of its fulfillment. And it was after the arrival of more economic equality in the 1970s in Canada that a growing majority of Canadians became more open to the claims of women and First Nations. More equality set the foundation for this change in attitude. So those who want to roll back social democracy and promote more inequality need to be told that the flourishing of differing individual talents will once again become readily available to only elite minority. Social rights, it must be remembered, are every bit attached to individuals as are political and civil rights. Here's a bit about the political philosophy. Indeed, in the daily lives of many, if not most, they are what make political and civil rights accessible. All rights, including those that have their origin and source for their fulfillment in groups or minorities, such as those of First Nations or Quebecois, ultimately reside in the lives of individuals in these groups. While any state, including those that have supported majorities, can repress individuals or groups, it has been one of the great and enduring falsehoods of the 20th century neoliberalism to claim that by definition the extension of government power is repressive of individual freedom. In a democracy, the general rule is in fact the opposite. For the majority, it is through regulatory or positive government action in a capitalist economy that an individualism is enabled to flourish. Cradled to the grave security, far from having the negative consequences normally claimed by opponents of social democracy, simply promises for the majority what through modern history children of the affluent have taken for granted: guaranteed health service, comprehensive education, and one day pensions ensuring retirement with dignity. It's offensive, but a reality that so many of those who have so much in our society spend such a great deal of their political energy trying to deny to the children of others what they provide as a birthright to their own. While it's true that economic capacity and other social commitments can lead to variations in the level of the provision of a social right, not all new high-cost drugs, for example, can be provided, a right remains a right. And to deny a social right, like health care, anywhere in Canada, on the grounds of being outmoded in 2013, has no more legitimacy in today's democracy than making such a claim about freedom of religion in the province of Quebec. They are both rights. There is no doubt that the provision of social rights has been weakened by the shift to a more global economy and a post-industrial society. In political terms, social democrats must build closer linkages with the new social movements and lead a very broad movement for progressive change in politics. In policy terms, it's clear to me that a regulated global capitalism will involve the creation of much more effective international institutions and not just a reassertion of the power of national governments. Social and economic rights within the framework of ecological sustainability need to be embedded in global economic governance. In short, social democracy cannot remain local while capital has gone global. Okay, some points I want to share or information with you about the state of Canadians' thinking. Have Canadians become more conservative? During the past 2 decades, inequality in Canada, as in many other democracies, has grown immensely. While GDP between 1981 and 2011 grew by 50%, the median hourly wage went up by only 10% over that period. Almost all the fruits of income growth have gone to the top 10%, and most of that, as many of you know, to the top 1%. And with the important exception of childcare in Quebec and full-day kindergarten in Ontario, in recent decades there's been no major social rights innovation. In the past year, it has been claimed in this context by some, read the Fraser Institute, the Manning Institute, and others, that during this period Canadians underwent a basic shift away from social democratic to conservative values. Well, in May of 2012, and again in May of this year, the Broadbent Institute commissioned Environics to survey Canadians, in part to determine empirically the accuracy of this claim. While it's wrong to exaggerate the significance of individual polls, I say here in my academic role, when their data are seen to fit into similar findings by Environics and by other academic research, their significance can be credibly emphasized. So what did we find out? In 2012, we looked at how Canadians view growing inequality, how serious it is, its link with the health of democracy, the role of government, and what Canadians personally would be prepared to do to reduce the inequality. A large majority of Canadians, 77%, believe that the widening of inequality is a big problem. 71% say that, quote, it undermines Canadian values. And while only a small percentage indicated that the widening gap was not a problem, a significant majority, including, please note, 58% of those Canadians who voted Conservative, said they personally would be prepared to pay somewhat more in taxes if the government used this money to protect public services and to reduce inequality as a priority. More than 2/3 of Canadians believe that the growing income gap means that fewer young people would do as well or better than their parents. In short, equality of opportunity is being undermined in Canada today. Cutting across all income, regional, and gender differences, Canadians believe the kind of inequality we are experiencing erodes the quality of our democracy, and they want governments to address the problem. Well, last year's poll, confirmed Canadian support for the core social democratic value of equality. The poll done this year, this May, is equally positive in once again showing that Canadians are not moving in a more conservative direction. Of particular significance is that this year's poll sought to determine whether there are significant differences between Canadians whose parents were born in Canada and those whose parents were not. The results are encouraging. Most Canadians in either category end up with statistically similar positive positions on most questions. In some instances, immigrants who have been in Canada less than 10 years do differ from Canadians whose parents were born here, such as on same-sex marriage and the use of marijuana. But in general, second-generation Canadians share the same values as those with parents born here in Canada. Thus, in response to some 16 questions, including those on public pensions, unions, abortion, crime, climate change, and the need for a robust government, significant majorities of Canadians indicate support for what most would regard as a progressive position or social democratic values. To summarize, the values of social democracy include a strong and equal commitment to civil and political rights, a commitment to a predominantly market-based economy but not a market-determined society, a commitment to a robust government with the authority and will to counteract the inegalitarian and environmentally unsustainable thrust of a market economy, the responsibility of government in ensuring high levels of employment, and an openness to the involvement of new social groups with new ideas. In spite of the effects of globalization in recent decades, those democratic countries in which egalitarian values and practices have dominated in past decades have produced many positive social outcomes in health, civility, longevity, crime rates, social mobility that most people would find laudable. I have stressed the important role in politics played by ideology. But obviously, the state of the economy is also important. It's clear the redistributive component of social democracy is easier to achieve in periods of solid economic growth when both profits and GDP are on the rise. While a rising tide clearly does not lift all boats, it does make it easier to rearrange their positions on the flotilla. What now? You're holding up pretty well there for a lecture as opposed to a speech, and I want to offer some concluding thoughts. With the clear results of years of sort of neoliberal fundamentalist economics, as our data show, Canadians are now open to change. They want a federal government that leads. They want jobs, housing, food on their tables, and adequate pensions. They want a fair share of income. They want corporations that are more responsive to their workers and communities. And they want an economy that's environmentally sustainable. Canadians, I want to stress, also have dreams for their children of becoming kids that want to become great musicians, athletes, skilled tradesmen, scientists, healthcare workers, inventors, movie directors, and writers. And in every young person, I also want to stress, there's an idealist longing to emerge and be welcomed by the broader population. These young people want an exuberant Canada. They want an inspiring, practical leadership that will show them that politics does matter. And I want to conclude with this. There are those in our country who say that current and probable future economic conditions make social democracy unsustainable. How, they ask, can we continue to promote such an agenda? I return the question. How is it that our economy over the past decade, and especially during the recent crisis, has been able to sustain record profits for banks and other major corporations, record gains for shareholders, record shares of wealth and income for the richest few in our country, records even higher than during the post-war boom, which was our golden age of social democracy? This has happened at the cost of low wages insecure labor, very low taxes for the same corporations and high-income groups, public funds of various kinds for banks and other businesses. It's very clear to me that there's room to shift our priorities from the minority to the majority. What is needed is a confident, and I stress confident, reassertion of the primacy of the social democratic values cherished by Canadians. What's needed at every level of our politics is leadership that will take us beyond indifference and cynicism to build a better Canada for us all. Thank you.